There's this whole industry that's arisen that just manufactures flavor. So it's not an accident that we like this food and we crave it. Elon Musk, richest man in the world, doesn't seem so happy. President of the United States, Donald Trump, seems really angry all the time. I hope that the last few decades will be looked back on as an anomaly and as maybe a last burst of a kind of ruthless capitalism that wasn't inevitable and that we can absolutely move beyond if we make the effort to do so.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast where we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Eric Schlosser, the investigative journalist and author whose work has fundamentally changed how we think about what we eat. Fast Food Nation was a landmark book that exposed the abuse of animals and the exploitation of workers at the heart of America's food industry. Now, 25 years after it was first published, Schlosser says he is astonished that not only has the industry failed to improve, in many ways it has gotten worse. And yet, despite this, he still believes change is possible. Eric Schlosser, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
How would you change the world?
Less greed, more compassion.
Greed is at the center of everything here, not just in terms of what we want to eat, but how it's produced.
You know, there was a film, Wall Street, that came out, I think, in the 90s in the States. And there was a character in it who argued that greed is good. And that was sort of the heart of American culture then, and in so many ways, unchecked, untrammeled, celebrated greed, I think, is responsible for so many of the social problems we have right now.
The book originally came about, I suppose, because of the exploitation of workers that you had discovered.
Yeah.
Just tell me about that.
I spent about a year following the harvest in California, writing about the exploitation of migrant farm workers, mainly undocumented workers from Mexico. And at the time, in the early 1990s, there was a Republican governor in California who wanted to be president. And he thought the route to becoming president, his name was Pete Wilson, was to demonize undocumented workers, to depict them as welfare cheats and parasites who were coming from Mexico to California to live off of taxpayers. And instinctively, aside from being offensive, from an economic point of view, that just didn't seem to make sense, because in the time I'd spent in California, the poor Mexican workers were mowing lawns, working as busboys, working as carpenters, doing all kinds of jobs. So I began to investigate the California economy. And at the time, agriculture was the number one sector of the California economy. And there'd been a huge increase in migrant workers. And what had happened was the crops that were most valuable and could generate the most income per acre required a lot of migrant workers. So I wrote about the strawberry, something that I love to eat and that people routinely eat without thinking about the fact that every one of those strawberries had to be carefully picked by hand because they damage so easily. So I wrote this article that looked at how, far from being parasites or welfare cheats, undocumented immigrants were the bedrock of the most important sector of the California economy. And the editors of Rolling Stone read that, and they said, we want you to do the same thing for fast food that you did for the strawberry. Sort of show where it comes from, what's going on behind the counter. And I didn't jump at the assignment because I ate at McDonald's. I really like hamburgers and French fries. I didn't want to write something that was condescending towards the food that most people eat. I mean, I like going to Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they didn't really have an idea of what they wanted the article to be. So I said, I'll think about it. I went to the library. Again, this is, late 1990s. I went to the library and I started reading extensively about the fast food industry. And it sort of amazed me how powerful they'd become in a very brief period of time, and how they transformed so much of American culture and the American economy without my knowing about it. And I started talking to friends of mine who were journalists about some of the things I was discovering. I said, did you know this? Did you know this? And, reasonably well-informed, well-educated people didn't know the kind of stuff that I was discovering. And that's when I said to Rolling Stone, I'll take the assignment. And that was the beginning of this book.
And this wasn't just about exploitation. I mean, this was real danger, death for people.
Yeah.
And real danger in terms of the food safety as well.
It was about food safety. And once you have gigantic slaughterhouses and processing facilities, you could spread contaminated meat nationwide or even overseas. Again, if you were to get a hamburger in the 1960s, 50s, it might have come from a local butcher shop and there would be pieces of one steer or 2 or 3 animals in it. A fast food hamburger coming from one of these gigantic facilities, might have pieces of hundreds, if not thousands of different animals in it. And that's an ideal vector for spreading disease because the odds that one of those animals might have some pathogen is increased. But if you looked at ground beef from the 1950s and you looked at ground beef from the 1980s or 90s, it wouldn't look any different. But it's a fundamentally different thing. One is something created at a little butcher shop. The other is an industrial commodity. And that's the kind of change that happened without our knowing it. And you can look at, what that food does to people, the rise of the obesity epidemic. And a lot of the book is really about the rise of unchecked corporate power in America. And that's what leads to the exploitation of immigrant workers and on and on and on. So I try to take this food that I was eating and my friends were eating without ever thinking about it and showing all the consequences that had been deliberately hidden.
Now, it was shocking and it provoked a huge amount of discussion.
Yeah.
And people would say, this is terrible. But ultimately, did the world sort of shrug its shoulders and just carry on eating the way it did?
Well, to a large extent, that's true. I think that when Fast Food Nation came out, there were 30,000 McDonald's, and now there's like 40,000 McDonald's. And it certainly didn't put that company out of business. I think, on the one hand, one book, it's kind of hard to change the world with one book, especially with the company that you're criticizing, McDonald's, spends $1 billion a year on marketing and promotion. And I'm so grateful to my publisher for keeping the book in print and, reissuing it. But $1 billion has not been spent to promote my point of view or the points of view of many other people who have criticized this industry. These are incredibly powerful corporations, and what they're selling is an inexpensive product. And for working people who don't have a lot of money to spend on food, who don't have a lot of time to cook for themselves, it's providing a service. The unfortunate thing, and this is something that I really get at in the new chapter I've written, is that the real price doesn't appear on the menu. The real cost of this food comes much later. If you had to pay for the dialysis for kidney disease at the moment that you were buying some of this ultra-processed food, it would be a lot more expensive.
Well, just take us through that then, in terms of the real cost. And to what extent is it to do with the producers? And to what extent is it to do with economic development, economic necessity, convenience, and taste?
Yeah. So what these fast food companies, meat packing companies, processed food companies have done incredibly successfully is externalize a lot of their business costs so that society pays for it and they don't have to pay for it. And I'll give you an analogy. During the 1970s in the United States, there was an environmental movement that arose. And what they were trying to do was make companies internalize their business costs, pay for their pollution. And the mantra in the 1970s was make the polluter pay. So a company that was dumping its waste into a river and people were getting sickened downstream, those sicknesses are the externalized costs of that business. And the environmental movement was fairly successful at making these companies pay for their own pollution. Now, when you get to the food industry, if a company is allowed to sell really contaminated meat, and you can't tell by looking at it or smelling it, and people are getting sick, they're externalizing their business costs. And it's really unfair because you might have two companies. One is producing ground beef that's free of fecal bacteria, free of pathogens, and one is producing totally contaminated meat, and the consumer has no way of telling the difference. That encourages companies to cheat because the company selling contaminated meat isn't held responsible. So a lot of what I'm arguing for is for the real cost of these products to become visible. For example, getting back to fast food, if you're targeting children with food that is unhealthy and highly likely to eventually make them obese or have all kinds of other health problems, those companies should either be restricted from doing that or have the real costs of that product reflected in the price of what it is.
I mean, there's obviously a difference between high fat, high salt, the things that are causing health crises around the world, and contamination causing illness. So what are you saying about that?
I would say,
bearing in mind, McDonald's is very litigious, and what are we supposed to think about the big brands and the safety of the food that we're buying?
So I would say there's a spectrum of harm, and tainted infant formula, which I write about in
which is back in the news now,
which is in the news in the UK. Tainted infant formula, contaminated ground beef might be on one far end of the spectrum, but it's not that far to get to ultra-processed foods, which we now know scientifically are linked to 30 different ailments from clinical depression to cancer and heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. There was a journal article in the States recently about ultra-processed food may have to be regulated in the same way tobacco has been, because these harms are proven now. They're not theoretical. So I'm not saying it all needs to be banned tomorrow afternoon. I'm just saying that it probably shouldn't be marketed to children. If you're 20 years old and you want to buy a pack of cigarettes and smoke cigarettes, I think that's perfectly, as long as you know what you're doing and the price of the tobacco reflects a lot of its harms. I mean, in the United States, the price of cigarettes has gone up enormously because of the harms that are now connected to smoking. And in the same way, ultra-processed food should probably be much more expensive, and healthy food that's good for you to eat should be much less expensive. And if it takes government subsidy to make healthy food less expensive, we should do that. And I don't want to bore your listeners, but it's mind-bending, the government subsidies right now in the United States that go to really unhealthy food. So it's not like there's a free market that is perfectly working, because a free market perfectly working would be the healthy foods are more available and the unhealthy foods are more difficult to get.
What are the government subsidies going to ultra-processed foods?
Right now, maybe it varies year to year. $20 to $30 billion a year are going to American farmers. That money isn't going to American farmers to grow fruit, vegetables, nuts, the foundation of a really healthy diet.
And these are not small family farms we're talking about.
And they're not small family farms. Those subsidies are going to growing corn, soybeans mainly, that is used, high fructose corn syrup, which is, a sweetener, but even more than that, to livestock feed. It's insane. I mean, the amount of cropland in the United States right now devoted to feeding livestock dwarfs the amount that's devoted. I'll give you an example that I just read recently, and it's not in the book. The United States right now has 100 million acres of land devoted to corn. And of that 100 million acres, the amount that is growing the kind of corn that we eat, corn on the cob, canned corn, corn tortillas, is about 350,000 acres. That's like 99.6% of that cropland is being used to grow corn that is animal feed or to grow corn that's ethanol, that's going into automobiles and is much more expensive than just having gasoline, or it's being used for industrial uses. So, 3%, maybe 5% of the cropland in the United States is being used to grow fruit, vegetables, nuts, and those growers get very, very little federal subsidies. If you want to understand why there's cheap, inexpensive chicken McNuggets, that's why. And I'm not making an argument for veganism or vegetarianism, but it's clear that, too much meat, especially red meat in your diet, is not good for you. And you should probably eat some fruit and veg. And the government is totally and completely subsidizing the opposite.
I mean, I obviously take your point on one book can't change the world, but it wasn't just one book. I mean, these have been arguments that have been really aired over 2 decades. Why do you think we just don't heed the message? Why has it got worse?
And I mean, I really like your point about one book. I am just so proud that the success of my book made it easier for other people to write on this same subject, and nothing's going to change because of one book. There now are lots of books, there are lots of films, documentaries, television shows. It's really important to get this information out. And there's been 2 things that I think that have blocked meaningful change. That is, the power of these multinational corporations is extraordinary. I mean, you mentioned McDonald's suing. I mean, McDonald's in this country in particular, because of the libel laws, has been very eager for many years to sue people who criticize it, and it's a real fragility. I mean, I write books, and when someone writes a bad review, I don't threaten them with a lawsuit because, I don't like what they said about me. And in a free society, you should be able to criticize these corporations. So it's not only the marketing power, $1 billion a year, it's their incredibly close relationships with government officials. I mean, McDonald's, subsidized the Labor Party for many years. And then there's another thing that may be more difficult to change. This food tastes good.
Yeah.
I mean, you
watch a documentary and you say it's really bad, but I feel like a McDonald's.
Here's the thing. I mean, I like French fries and chips. If you eat them twice a day, every day for 20 years, that's not going to be good. So this food, this industrial food, is carefully designed to make it taste good, to make you want to eat it. I mean, in the book, I get into the flavor industry, and when you have ultra-processed food, you're destroying a lot of the taste of it. When you're eating something, it's the aroma of the food as you're chewing it that's released. And so there's this whole industry that's arisen that just manufactures flavor. They're highly complex chemical compounds that they then add to the processed food so that when you're eating it, it tastes like what it's supposed to. You could add those flavor compounds to this book and chew the pages, and it would taste like a French fry, or it would taste like a milkshake. So it's not an accident that we like this food and we crave it. But if you look at what's happening to the health of adults and children in the United States and in the United Kingdom, right now in the United States, 3/4 of the adults are obese or overweight. In the United Kingdom, I think it's 65% of the adults are obese or overweight. And if you were to put that on a graph and look at fast food consumption and look at the obesity rate, they parallel one another. So again, this food seems inexpensive when you're eating it, but the NHS is dealing with the consequences of this diet. And, I'm not here as an evangelist for one set of diets or one don't eat this food or that food, but I feel like my role has really been to expose these things to people, to show people what they're eating, to show the potential consequences so that there's an element of choice that doesn't exist when there's only mass marketing.
Yes, because the choice, in truth, doesn't really exist for most people because, food that if you're trying to eat a non-ultra-processed diet, it's expensive, it's difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think we have appreciated or understood the extent to which food is knitted into our capitalist democracies?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that I'm trying to demonstrate. I mean, this is a form of monopoly capitalism. These companies talk about the free market and do everything they can to eliminate any real competition. And one of the things, sadly, that's gotten worse since this book came out is that one sector of the American economy after another has been taken over by 2 or 3 companies. And there's a measurement of competition called the 4-firm ratio. And if 4 companies control 40% of the market or more, it means you really don't have a free market anymore. You have an oligopoly or you have a monopoly. And, a lot of this is doom and gloom, but here's one thing that's encouraging to me. Since this book came out, and I'm not taking credit for it, I'm just saying this has happened. There's been a huge growth in awareness among people who are wealthy and well-educated about the harms of ultra-processed food and fast food. And there's a separate food system that has arisen to serve them. I mean, just if you were to look at the restaurants in London in 1990 and look at the restaurants today, or you were to look at what well-educated and wealthy people are eating today, they're eating so much more healthy. There's so much more, there's so much more interest in exercise. And what's unjust about it is that if you have the means, you can have a really healthy lifestyle. And I've seen people change their eating habits because of this new information. What's unfair is that if you don't have the money and you're working at a low-wage job, or you're working at more than one low-wage job, it's more difficult and it's more time-consuming to eat healthy. It's not impossible, but you have to be much more conscious. You probably have to make your own food. And one of the disturbing things, and fast food is fast, it's convenient, it's inexpensive, and for a lot of people, they need that in their lives.
What do you think is going on in America right now? I mean, we all know about Trump and his love of McDonald's, and he serves it on a plane and in the White House and all the rest of it. But you also have RFK Jr. running health and the whole, Make America Healthy Again initiative. Now, RFK Jr. is really blunt about saying Trump's diet is a disaster. It's amazing he's still alive. And he was brought in to try and make, people's diets better.
Yeah.
I mean, is he really doing that?
There's an American expression. They're putting lipstick on a pig. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. is the lipstick. Trump was politically savvy. He realized that Bobby Kennedy's endorsement in the political campaign would help him enormously. I think that Bobby Kennedy Jr. probably swung the vote in favor of Trump. Bobby Kennedy Jr. brought 4%, 5% of the vote to Trump, mainly white, suburban women concerned about health. I disagree with almost everything Bobby Kennedy says, stands for. I give him credit for one thing. He saw that the issue of healthy food would resonate with some voters, and he was willing to speak out on it in a way that mainstream Democratic politicians and no Republicans would really do. But this is all lip service. And if you look at what the Trump administration is actually doing, they're not revolutionizing the food system. What's crazy is the Make America Healthy Again report. There are sections of the report that look like they've just been taken right out of Fast Food Nation, criticizing, unchecked corporate power in the food system, criticizing ultra-processed food, advocating on behalf of real food. But that's all talk. If you look at what the administration is doing, they've gutted the public health system, gutted food safety investigations. I mean, if McDonald's was really afraid that the Trump administration was going to hurt its business, they wouldn't have invited President Trump to address the biggest gathering of their executives and franchisees a few months ago. And anyone who's interested can look at that speech online. Not only was Trump the first person to address the top levels of McDonald's, but he gave a very bizarre speech, as he normally does, and he was wildly applauded throughout. So I think that the big, and one other point, the single largest donor to the Trump-Vance inauguration was JBS, the biggest meatpacking company in the world. So the meatpacking companies, the fast food companies who are really worried about an increase in the minimum wage, they've got nothing to worry about with President Trump in the White House. And what Bobby Kennedy says, you know, if anything, I mean, I don't know if Jon Stewart did a brilliant takedown of all the kind of furor about Bad Bunny's halftime show. And they showed Bobby Kennedy Jr. talking about what you should be eating during the halftime show. And they asked Bobby Kennedy what he was going to eat. And he said that all he eats are meat and ferments. And I wasn't even sure what ferments was. I had to look it up. Ferments are yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi.
Healthy stuff.
Yeah, but he's eating meat and ferments, and he said you should be eating yogurt during the Super Bowl. People aren't listening to Bobby Kennedy.
But this is more, isn't it? Isn't it actually more insidious than that? In that, what they have now established is that you can have these twin tracks coexisting, where the official message of the U.S. government is to eat healthily, and the official practice of the U.S. government is to downgrade food safety and to encourage factory farming.
It's absolutely infuriating. And there are other people who I've worked with. I mean, I have a friend who has been working to change this food system for years, and she had this effort called Real Food Media, and now Bobby Kennedy's whole mantra is real food. But oddly enough, his message really helps the meatpacking industry. If you look at the new nutritional guidance that Bobby Kennedy has put forward, we need to be eating more meat, mainly meat, and full-fat dairy. There's a brilliant scientist who I follow in the States named Eric Topol. He's a researcher at the Scripps Institute, absolutely brilliant. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a Nobel Prize at some point. And when Bobby Kennedy said that, he put online a summary of all the scientific studies that say you should be eating more red meat and that red meat is good for you to eat. And it was a blank page. So this is madness. And Bobby Kennedy's anti-vaccine stance is probably going to lead to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people dying. And his opposition to mRNA vaccines could lead to people dying in pandemics. There's an expression, the lunatics have taken over the asylum. And my hope is these policies are so crazy and so devoid and divorced from reality and from science that this is almost like a fever that's going to break, and that we're going to have rational thought in Washington, D.C. once again.
We'll see.
Yeah.
I mean,
hopeful.
you mentioned oligopoly. I mean, can you give us a sense of what's happened over the last 25 years in terms of farm ownership and food production?
Yeah.
In terms of the reduction of actual competition?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you had gone to the United States in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we drank a lot of milk and we made a lot of cheese, and we had a lot of dairy farmers. And, 80% have been wiped out in the last 30 years. And whereas you used to have dairy herds of 80 to 100 animals, you now have mega dairies that could have as many as 100,000 cows, 80,000 cows. Human beings have been eating meat and raising livestock for thousands and thousands of years, but we've only had factory farms like this for 20, 30, maybe 40 years. And this has led to enormous concentrated power in the food industry. I'll give you an example. Right now you have one company, Danone, that controls more than 70% of the market in the United Kingdom for infant formula. One company. And no matter how well-intended Danone is, no matter how badly they want to provide healthy infant formula, when you only have one company, that causes all kinds of potential for a problem. And, it looks like the ingredient in the formula has been imported from China and is tainted. So in these food markets, as in every market, you want lots of companies competing to provide the best food and the best services as possible. And if there's a problem with one of those companies, you don't have to face the possibility, well, maybe infants aren't going to eat, which happened in the United States a couple of years ago when the biggest infant formula factory in the United States had to shut down because of contamination, and people were suddenly, searching shelves at grocery stores to find infant formula. And I'm not singling out Danone as a bad actor or anything like that. I'm just saying when you look beneath the surface, you see remarkable market power in one sector, not only the food industry, but of the economy as a whole.
So why are you hopeful about change? Is it that you think things will just get so bad that the world will wake up?
So, I studied history academically, and I pushed back against and refused to believe in any theories of history that require something to be inevitable. So none of this was inevitable. And a lot of what I do in Fast Food Nation is show, how did this happen? And once you see how it happened, and once you believe things aren't inevitable, you also believe things don't have to be the way they are. We have agency. We don't have to buy this food. We don't have to support these companies. We don't have to support a political system that's corrupted by money. And back to history. In the 1890s in the United States, all of the problems that I'm just describing, unchecked corporate power, incredible inequality between the wealthy and the poor, contaminated products out on the market without any ramifications, that all existed. And in a way, we've gone back to the jungle. And a lot of the book is describing how that happened. But these problems were addressed, and if not fully solved, largely solved. You go back to the United States in the 1960s, there were wealthy people, but there was an incredibly strong and vibrant middle class. There were people working in slaughterhouses and abattoirs, but there were incredibly strong labor unions. And if you had a job in a meatpacking plant in the 1960s, you had a solid middle class life. So I'm not saying, I'm in favor of rocket ships so that we can colonize Mars. That seems delusional. And the billionaire in the United States who supports that, I think, is completely delusional. These are social problems that were addressed, that were partially solved, and we've seen a real regression. And I get back to, where we started this conversation, too much greed, celebration of greed. And for all the wealth and power that the new oligarchs of the United States have achieved, and I'm talking about Elon Musk, for example, richest man in the world, doesn't seem so happy. President of the United States, Donald Trump, has made himself a billionaire through all kinds of unethical business deals. Seems really angry all the time and unhappy. So maybe we need to scrutinize more carefully some of the things that society is celebrating, this sort of unchecked materialism, greed, desire for power, and think, well, is that really going to make me happy? And if there are other things that are important, maybe it's worth fighting for those other values like compassion, defending the vulnerable, like immigrants. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. And I think, and I hope that the last few decades will be looked back on as an anomaly and as maybe a last burst of a kind of ruthless capitalism that wasn't inevitable and that we can absolutely move beyond if we make the effort to do so.
And where do you think the balance lies between individual action as consumers and, as all taking decisions that I'm not going to eat fast food anymore and I'm going to try and eat healthy and all the rest of it, and government action? Because government action is not very hopeful in America right now.
Yeah.
So what can people do?
So I don't think, given all the problems that we've just been discussing, I really don't think we can shop our way out of it. There's definitely things that you can do as a consumer. These big companies, are predicated on growth. And, I can't remember, it might have been Edward Abbey who said that they have the same mentality as the cancer cell, which is continual growth. As a consumer, it hurts them if their sales decline by 1%. It hurts them enormously if their sales decline by 10%. And if their sales decline by 20%, maybe they'll go out of business. So it doesn't take everybody tomorrow saying, I'm not going to McDonald's. It just means 2%, 3%, 5% not doing it. So you absolutely have power as a consumer. If you choose to give your money to the independent coffee shop where you know the person who owns it and not to Starbucks, that makes a difference. But beyond that, there's really like an old-fashioned word, at least in the States, which is, you need to be not just a consumer. I don't want to say you need, but it would be great if you weren't just a consumer, but you were a citizen, which means having a sense of the public good and working together. And I really believe that despite the fact that the political system in the United States and in the United Kingdom has been completely corrupted by money. Back at the history of the 1890s in the United States, there were senators who were literally bought and sold and owned by different industry. There was the guy who was owned by the rail industry, et cetera, et cetera. So while there's life, there's hope. And while you still have power at the ballot box, it doesn't have to be this way. And I don't expect, again, it's going to change, overnight. But you look at other societies and they eat food, they go to restaurants, and they don't have the same public health problems or the same levels of corruption at the highest levels of government as the United States and the United Kingdom have.
And you began this whole story with immigrants and immigrants being exploited and living in fear. Obviously, that's very reminiscent of where we are right now.
Yeah.
What do you think is different now? Do you think people are tolerating it more or less? Or is it just the same?
Makes me angry to the core of my being, what's happening to immigrants in the United States right now. I mentioned when we started out this conversation about Governor Pete Wilson demonizing immigrants in California. It didn't work for him. He never became president. There was a huge backlash against him. And Trump used it, and it worked. And it worked. You see these demonstrations that are happening in Minnesota right now, and they're amazingly encouraging. And the courage of the people who are standing up to ICE, ordinary citizens, it's inspiring. And I plan to go there. It's not working for Trump suddenly. He's pushed it too far. Voters who are anti-immigrant bought into the lie that, all these immigrants are rapists and murderers, et cetera, et cetera. And they're now seeing ordinary people, family members, children being arrested on the street and put in detention centers. It's horrible beyond words, but I think it's turning against Trump. His popularity is reaching all-time lows, and I don't know how he's going to turn it around. I wrote recently something for The Atlantic magazine about Trump's anti-immigrant crusade and the profound racism at the core of it. And he's constantly talking about immigrants as murderers and armed robbers. And there was a very, very thorough study that was done in Texas of the rates of crime by immigrants and the rates of crime by people who were born in Texas. And the conclusion of that study is, firstly, immigrants commit much less crime than people who are born in Texas. So in the article, I made this point, which is absolutely true. Texas would be a lot safer place if all the people who were born there left and got deported. And if you just kept the immigrants in Texas, crime would be way down. My experience over decades of looking at the role of immigrants and undocumented immigrants in the United States, some of the most hardworking, unbelievably family value-oriented people who've come to America because they want to make a better life for themselves and their families, and who truly embody what I think are the best things about the United States. And the fact that they are being demonized, terrorized, and literally being put in detention centers is a disgrace for which there almost are no words.
Eric Schlosser, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.